believe everybody has just about made their way to the classes. We will begin here continuing our study of the intertestament period. Last week, Brittany, as your mouthpiece for the class, she said, you kind of lost me there toward the end. You were going too fast. So we're going to go by way of review for just a moment, and then we will get into the rest of the text or the rest of the study of where we're getting to. So maybe through these slides, I will go through them fairly quickly, not too quickly, but trying to kind of touch back on some of the things that maybe you've missed out on last week, or maybe you failed to get written down if you're taking notes. But anyway, what we're looking at, what we'd like to get into today, what's significant is when you get into the Maccabean revolt, and that's where we're at. This happening around, again, 166 BC-ish, somewhere around in there. Again, a little bit before that. But you're getting into the Maccabean revolt, where the Maccabees are going to, and the Jews are going to fight against Syria. Now, Syria is important. They're not fighting against Rome. What we're going to look at as we get a little farther into our study, Rome is not in the picture yet. We're going to get into the diverse beast in the next study or so. But what we're still looking at now in the Palestine area, but we're going to be talking about the Jews fighting against the Syrians, or the Seleucids. So when you talk about the Seleucids, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, that's the man we're talking about. He was a Syrian. So Mattathias was the man, the older man. Now again, when what was happening was that Antiochus IV was telling the Jews to sacrifice swine on the altar in the temple, the altars to Zeus. They built altars to Zeus, and they were telling them to sacrifice swine on that. And obviously a Jew was not even to touch a swine or touch a pig, but they were telling them to sacrifice these unclean animals. So he revolts against this. Now, what's going to be important today as we get farther are these boys, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. So those men are really important, and especially Simon and Jonathan when we get a little farther. Now, Judas, he was going to be the one that was really significant in the military standpoint. We talked about him last week as being, he was called Judas Maccabeus, or the Hammer. He was he led this militia of Jews and fought many engagements with the Syrians, but ultimately met his demise. So these guys, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, are going to be important as we go farther through our study. Now again, 166, Matthias dies. Again, Simon is called the guide, Judas Maccabeus, the Hammer. These men kind of take over this revolt, and then they recapture, we talked about this in closing, they recapture Jerusalem. They go in to rededicate the temple. They're tearing down these altars, and they find the oil in to burn on the lamp, and that's when we get, they thought they had enough to burn it for one day, but it lasted for 8 days, and last week as we talked about that's becomes the Feast of Dedication, or what the Jews would call Hanukkah now, and that's why it's 8 nights that they celebrate that. But when you hear about the Feast of Dedication in the New Testament, this came about, again, separate from the feast that we discuss in the Old Testament. This became later on, but the Jews would hold fast to this. Now, that's some double slides here. So again, Simon, it's not the one I want, I must have, okay. So anyway, so Mattathias, he has died, and his 5 boys they've got to take on. Now, Eleazar, he is going to die in battle. It's an interesting account. There were some Syrians coming into battle, and at that time they rode on the backs of the elephants. A lot of the generals had those things. There's a nation that's going to try to attack Rome, but they can't because God says there's only going to be 4 kingdoms and then the church. So they're at Carthage. They're going to fight against that. And you have those men having the elephants in battle. That was a big deal. So anyway, Eleazar, he tries to do what he thinks is right. He thinks there's some royalty on this elephant. So he runs through the battle and tries to kill this elephant, but ends up getting stepped on by the elephant and obviously dies from that. So that's how he meets his demise. Pretty bad way to go out, being stepped on by an elephant. But it was really kind of lackluster because even the elephant didn't really have anybody important on it. So he kind of a needless death there with Eleazar. So that's one of the boys. Then we have Judas, again, Judas Maccabeus. He's going to go, he's really the ringleader of this. He's really the general, if you will. So he's going to be killed in battle when 1,000 Jews try to go up against 20,000 Syrians. So when you read, again, this is a brief overview. So when you read that account of Judas, he said that he would not turn his back. He was not going to be a coward, even though he knew that they probably weren't going to make it. Again, 20-1, what they were fighting against. He says, I'm going to go anyway. I'm going to fight. And he did lead a lot of excursions like this and actually made it out. But ultimately, this time, the numbers were too many. And he meets his end there in that battle. So there's Judas, there's Eleazar. They have both died. So after that, Jonathan, he is going to be the one that actually kind of steps into this leadership role, and he's going to be more than the general. He's going to be kind of the governor over Jerusalem. So they're going to be kind of taking all this land back from the Syrians. So he's going to kind of elevate himself up to this type of elevation, political and religious. Again, we're going to get into that. But he said, I'm going to be the general. I'm going to be the governor. I'm the guy running the show here. So, but he doesn't last long either. So Judas dies, Eleazar's dead, then Jonathan, he kind of steps into that role, but then we find that Jonathan dies as well, and that eventually leads to Simon. So this is when it's really, really important that I'll slow down here. So you have, again, Judas, Eleazar dies, Judas dies, and then Jonathan dies. Then you have Simon. So John, I couldn't find much on him. We don't see him quite as much as these other boys. So Simon, he's going to kind of, again, Jonathan being the governor and the general, he's going to kind of have this idea of having this peace that's going to be given. He kind of works some deals out with the Syrians and kind of doing some of this stuff. And so he's going to take on the title of leader and high priest. Now, what's wrong with that? So again, you see the timestamp around 142 BC. So the Jews, who had to be, what tribe did you have to be out of to be a priest? Yeah, Levi. All right, good. So you have to be from the tribe of Levi. So what we find here is these priests kind of setting themselves up, not really following along with that, but more of a political view instead of a religious view. That I will be the high priest, and I'm going to be the guy that's kind of overseeing all of these things. Now Simon, again, this is where it gets important. He gains the independence. He promotes himself. What we have from Simon is what we have is called the Hasmonean dynasty. So we're going to get into some names you're going to kind of hear, and you think, oh, I've heard that before. The Hasmonean dynasty. So Hasmon was an ancestor of Mattathias, which was the father of Simon. So what leads from this Hasmonean dynasty is a line of priest kings that would rule Israel until Roman occupation in 63 BC. So again, we're not to Rome yet. Rome's kind of getting their stuff worked out. What we're going to read about soon will be about Julius Caesar. We'll read about him, and then we'll have Pompey and Julius Caesar winning over that, and then Octavian coming in, again, Rome kind of having that, but we'll get to all that, but that's where we're headed, but Rome isn't in the picture yet. So what we have now is this Hasmonean Empire. Now, what we get from the Hasmonean dynasty, I'll wait just a minute. What we're going to get is some of the rulers that we're going to hear with our ears. When we get in there, we're going to say, oh, I've heard that, right? I'm a Bible student. I've heard these names before. So this is going to be interesting. Brittany was trying to write this down as I was showing her some of the slides, so I'm going to try to slow down. We've got plenty of time. So again, but what we're looking at is this stemming from Mattathias, the five boys, the Maccabean revolt, and coming down from that, and that being of the line of Simon from Mattathias. So again, these Jews that were just in Modin, in the area in Palestine. So from these individuals, what we're going to get, now I don't know how good you, maybe toward the back you may not be able to read that as good, but up close you might be able to read that. But what we essentially have is Mattathias is going to be at the top, Simon, Judas, Jonathan, just like we talked about, but Simon's son is going to be called John Hyrcanus. Now, if you've ever studied a little bit in the Intertestament period, if you've ever kind of looked back into some of this stuff before, John Hyrcanus, you should remember that name. Now, what's going to be important with him again, going back, tracing this, we're getting somewhere. You're going to get Aristobulus. If I'm saying that, I think so, Brittany. I was trying to explain it to her, and it's hard to say. It's hard for me. I've got to look at it. But Aristobulus, and then you're going to have Alexander Janus, and then Alexandra Salome. So these individuals coming out of John Hyrcanus. So without getting in the weeds, now again, if you want to do some more study on this, that's fine. It's a good study. But eventually what we're going to come down to is you're going to have Hyrcanus II, Alexandra, and Alexander. They're going to have a child, a girl, Miriam, and Herod the Great is going to marry Miriam. So that's where we're getting this. Notice as well, from Aristobulus II, you have Herod Antipas. So when you see the name Herod in the Bible, sometimes when you read the account of Jesus and the birth, and then you find Herod, he's going to kill all the Jews, that's Herod the Great. And then what we find is you hear a Herod later on in the New Testament, a Herod later on in Acts, but sometimes it's Herod Antipas. So going to be a nephew over here. So that's important because Herod is a title like Pharaoh. So there's not really, when you're looking at that, you think, oh, well, Herod, it's not the same Herod. So ultimately what we're looking at is this is a Jewish lineage that's going down through the line, and Miriam is a Jew, but Herod is not. Herod is going to be an Idumean. Now we're going to get to that here in just a moment. He's going to be an Idumean. I'll just leave that up here for just a minute, and then because this will help me in the next slide over. So again, he's not a Jew, but he's going to marry into this Jewish line of priest kings. Okay, that's important. The Hasmonean dynasty, priest kings, coming down again, stemming back to Mattathias and the Maccabean revolt. Now, let's look at this for a moment. The Hasmonean Empire. If you want to get back to that timeline, I can flip it back for you later on. John Hyrcanus, the guy we've been talking about. Again, John Hyrcanus is the son of Simon. So this man is influential because he took the throne and began to have an expansion of this, and he's doing these different, again, a government-style, religious, king-type priest idea. So he defeats the Idumeans in the south. So the Edomites, we've talked about that, if you'll remember, way back when we kind of started this study, we were talking about Jacob and Esau, and Esau's descendants were Edom, right? Esau is Edom, the Edomites. If you remember us talking about that, I said we would get to this eventually. Here we are. So the Edomites, Jacob, Esau, and Esau's descendants were of Edom. So what we find is Idumea is Latin for Edom. So that's why we call him an Edomite, or Edomite, or Idumea. And so he forces Judaism upon them. So now, again, let's go back, slow down for just a minute. For the Bible student looking at this, Jacob, Esau, Hebrews coming out of Abraham, and then we find the Jews, again, as Brother Guyan Woods, you think of the difference between a Hebrew, an Israelite, and a Jew, is the Hebrew was a descendant of Abraham, then an Israelite was from the tribe of Israel for the 12 tribes, and then the Jews were from the tribe of Judah. So, again, we go back. Why do we call them Judah? Because they had gone into Babylonian captivity. They had carried away, Israel was carried away by Assyria. Judah is left. Judah gets carried away into Babylonian captivity. The prophets say they are going to bring you back. Jeremiah says, I'm going to bring you back. It's all going to be under one tribe. You're now Judah, the tribe of Judah, the Jews. So when we look at Judaism, the old law, the Messiah, the law of Moses, being passed down on these Edomites, or the Idumea, because they didn't have that relationship. They were of Esau. Now, they were a descendant of Abraham, but they weren't a descendant following through with Moses and following the 12 tribes in that sense, right? The 12 tribes of Jacob, and then Moses coming out of that and giving the Old Testament. So, interesting there. The Edomites. So, he's pressing this Judaism upon them, right? The practice of this. Now, here's Idumea. For those who can see, this is a little dark on the scale, I'm sorry. But Judea is up here. You can see Jerusalem, Idumea, all this area down south of here. So these individuals, they have gone through this, and they're expanding in this area. So John Hyrcanus goes down and he begins to really stress this Judaism upon the Edomites, though they weren't, again, under the law of Moses. Now, Alexander Janus, the son of John Hyrcanus. So again, I know these names are hard. They're hard for me to pronounce. They're hard for me to get in my head. But John Hyrcanus was the son of Simon, who was the son of Mattathias. So now we have Alexander coming along. So he continued this. So he's gaining territories as extensive as the kingdom of David and Solomon. So when, again, we went back to our study of Hebrew history, this being part of it, I guess, as well. But Solomon, the kingdom of Solomon was very great. It had the greatest expanse under David and Solomon. So he's kind of getting this opened up. Now notice that last point, these later Hasmoneans openly adopted Hellenistic ways. So Hellenism is from Greek-speaking, though that from Alexander the Great. He likes the Greek culture. He carries the Greek culture wherever he goes. So this Greek language is in the area, and the Hasmoneans, they begin to really adopt this Hellenistic way. So this is important when we get to this. He really begins to really open up this, and they say, all right, we want to really press. They're kind of pressing Judaism, then they're kind of pressing Greek culture on top of that. Now, what do we get from this? And this is where we're going to get to. Out of the growing alienation, the religious-minded Hasidim began to separate themselves from the Hasmonean leadership and from political life in general. Two groups which emerged from this separation were the Pharisees and the Essenes. So this is what we're trying to get at with this part of the study, is because the group was adopting this Hellenistic lifestyle, right? This Greek style of living. What we find now is these stern Jewish individuals, they become the Pharisees and the Essenes, and eventually the Sadducees. So again, when we read the Old Testament, we don't read about Pharisees or Sadducees or Essenes, but in the New Testament, we read about these Jews that have certain beliefs, right? The Sadducees, they didn't believe in the resurrection, they didn't believe in angels, all of this stuff, and that's the easy way to remember, right? They're sad, you see, because they don't believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees, they believed in the resurrection, they believed in God, they were looking for this Messiah to come, and they were very staunch in the law. Now, the Essenes, you don't hear as much about them maybe when you read through the Bible, but the Essenes in history, they were a little bit more, they really stressed the idea of punishing oneself, that they needed to be separated from the world. They kind of had this pious religion about themselves like that. They stayed to themselves and they depraved themselves of certain things, and that meant them closer to God. When you do a little research on the Dead Sea Scrolls, down and around in that area, those caves, those individuals that they claim that were a part of that group were the Essenes. So these are those groups. This Essene, they were very staunch to the law, and they were really so they preserved this law, right? That's why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. They preserved all these scrolls in these caves, because as the Romans came in to destroy everything, right? They were moving all of these things. They said, we don't want this to be taken away. So what we find is they keeping that back. And again, the Dead Sea Scrolls is an amazing account when you go back and read that they found these. And again, at a very crucial time. And many of them thought it was going to disprove the Bible. We found this. We can date these all the way back. But in fact, it helped support the Bible tremendously. So great find on that. Very interesting. Again, I think the boy was throwing a rock in the cave to scare out a goat. Heard the clay pot break. They went in, found all these clay jars that had the Dead Sea Scrolls in them, or again, scrolls from the Dead Sea area. That's why we call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're not anything more specific than that. But what we find here is that they have these two groups. Now they emerge from this, the Pharisees and the Essenes. Now, both groups opposed not only the corruption of the Hellenization of the Hasmonean priest kings, but also the elimination of the traditional balance of power between the king from the line of David and the high priest descendant from Levi. So again, we have this man that's setting himself up in this position to where he doesn't really need to have. The kings were supposed to come down again from David, and the priests were supposed to come down from Levi. And what we have here is from this dynasty, a group of men that were not engaged in this. Now, what we'll get into, and I ran through that. Usually I have too much and I go too fast, and I told Brittany yesterday, I said, that should be enough. She said, yeah, that'll be enough to get through. But we have 10 minutes, so I'll try to kind of button it up here, and then that'll be that. But what we're looking at, again, what we're going to get into is Herod the Great, this Idumean. He's not a Jew, but he's going to be in this position of political power, and so we see him again called the King of the Jews. Herod was the King of the Jews, so that's why Herod, when he heard of that there was a king born in Bethlehem, when we read of the birth account there, that he hears that there's going to be a new king of the Jews being born, he tries to destroy those boys from that time frame, 2 years old and younger, because he's the king of the Jews and he does not want any competition. So we're going to see him elevated here, should be next week. Herod being in that way, then we're going to begin to kind of see Rome coming into the picture as well. After that, we'll probably, when we get into Rome, and then again we'll get into the New Testament, the time frame that we're looking at in that frame, and then we'll kind of take a break from this and do a little something different. So any questions? We've got some time. I don't know that I can answer them, but any questions or comments there about any of that so far? Or do you need to see a slide back? Okay, well, like I said, I tried to not have a lot. That way I would not try to run through a lot, but ran through it anyway. So we'll kind of get a whole, again, I hope this is beneficial to you. When you look at it in a big picture like this, it really helps you understand the New Testament. I think when you have a better understanding of the Old and those things happening, it really helps you when you look at the New.